The simple question of AI contributions in your codebase is one that more projects will need to answer. This is not something you can put to the side. This is not something you can just forget about. You need to decide whether or not you're going to allow AI contributions in your codebase, along with, if you are going to allow them, to what extent. Documentation, translation, writing code. What are you going to do? So a bit back, I saw this post from Andreas Kling. Fascinating that some open source projects forbid contributors from using LLMs. My prediction: in a few years, the progress gap between projects with/without this policy will be brutal. I don't know what the situation is going to be in a couple of years, but I do think this is a reasonable take to have. If you think that the technical aspect of these tools is not going to be dealt with, you are delusional. These tools are getting better every single day. Now, there are still the moral, ethical, and of course the legal questions to answer there. The legal one probably being the most important, as the status of AI code is not a fully answered question, and where it is answered, it's not always a consistent answer. Some countries will define how it is used, others, it's still a very open question. So with that in mind, what should you do about it? And not too long ago, this project was raised in the Servo project and also has been dealt with. So they ultimately decided, hey, maybe we shouldn't go about doing this. There was probably a better way to approach this than what we did, so let's move on from this saga. But I think it's still valuable to go over what actually happened here and the mistakes they made in trying to make this change. Earlier this year, a member of the TSC, the Technical Steering Committee, requested permission to experiment with GitHub Copilot. We granted them permission to do that for a single feature as an experiment, so we can better understand and document their process and potentially reevaluate our AI policy. I think this is a really good way to go about it. Run a small-scale test, see if it's even a good idea to consider in the first place. If these tools are absolute garbage in the codebase, there's no point even doing so. The problem is they never documented the fact publicly that they were doing an experiment on this. So this right here is the first place that anybody even knew this was going on, outside of that committee. After the experiment, we started discussing what to do about our AI policy. Namely, should we keep our current policy or allow specific exceptions? A poll within the TSC showed that we were quite divided about what to do next, with similar votes in favor of each option. And we're now proposing the following changes to our AI policy. Update the AI policy to allow some usage of AI tools to make the project more inclusive and accessible, like using translation tools, tools to improve the language, etc. These are not related to code contribution directly, but how folks participate in the project, so documentation, translation, things like that. 1 year testing period that allows Servo maintainers that request it to experiment with GitHub Copilot. After that year, and with the experience gained, we will revisit this topic. This testing period is subject to the guidelines below. So even during this period, not everyone could do so, only explicitly allowed members. PRs created using Copilot should be tagged accordingly. This allows maintainers to pay close attention when reviewing them. So rather than being that single feature that was being tested on, it's more of a wide-scale testing. Set the suggestions matching public code setting to block. This lowers the risk of copyright violations, and use it only for things like autocomplete, small snippets, and refactors, but not for full code generation. Basically, allowing the tools, but only for certain people, and only a very small subset of what these tools are capable of doing. Which, if you're running a test, is probably the best way you can do it. Assuming people were aware that you were going to be running a test in the first place. As one should obviously expect, this was a fairly controversial change, especially considering the way the current policy was being written. Effectively, all this says is no. No AI. The rest of this here is just explaining why no. Now, there is a lot of feedback here, and frankly, a lot of it is duplicated because, people are going to have similar concerns. I'm not going to read everything. I will leave the thread link down below, though, so let's go over some of the main points that were brought up. Firstly, just to clarify, does usage of some AI tools to make the project more inclusive and accessible include documentation? One could argue translating documentation to other languages or documenting some obscure parts of the code count as making Servo more accessible. The reason I'm asking is that generating semi-coherent documentation with LLMs is very low effort for contributors, but it usually misses the point of documenting obscure code, including more context, decisions, things that are not obvious from the code itself. Also, if you have a slight mistranslation, a word maybe you're not intending to use, additional context that is added that has nothing to do with the project itself, basically what you get, right? Bad or inaccurate documentation is most of the time worse than no documentation, because with no documentation, at least you know that you don't know anything. With bad documentation, you think you know something, and it's gonna send you down a weird, incorrect route. With another person saying, I would argue it's much more important for documentation to be precise and correct than for it to be written in perfectly grammatically correct language. Of course, I imagine this to be weighted against a reduction of workload for people writing the documentation. However, I generally find it more productive to not find an answer to a question immediately than to get a wrong answer. This is exactly what I am saying. My personal experience with AI-generated answers from search engines has been they often confidently present completely wrong answers, and it's less work to ignore them and look for answers from authoritative sources, i.e. documentation, from the start, than trusting the AI-generated answer and finding out it's wrong later. And this is something that's basically written in the existing policy, that you can find answers about Servo from these AI tools, but oftentimes they're just making up nonsense. Now, for a lot of stuff, don't get me wrong, these tools are really good, but when they are wrong, unless you know why they are wrong, in which case you're probably not looking for documentation on why a thing is happening, it's hard to know why it's wrong. With another person saying, specifically on documentation, as said in some of the answers here, AI is not reliable in authoring documentation or even necessarily being able to make full sense of how code works to generate documentation. My secondary languages are French and Ukrainian, and machine translation can perform okay in French sometimes, but it is not good at all at Ukrainian. I am concerned that using machine translation could cause documentation that does not make sense, or in worst case, could be actively harmful. This is another problem. This is the same problem that you have with programming languages, where a language that has the most data in the dataset, it's generally going to be pretty good, like, say, a Python or JavaScript. But if you want an AI tool to generate maybe COBOL, it's going to be a lot less good at that, and the same is true with spoken language as well. Now, as for the copyright issue, considering that it only lowers but not eliminates the risk of copyright violations, is Servo equipped financially, etc., to handle a situation where a copyright violation occurs? Who covers the eventual cost of litigation if someone decides to sue Servo, Agalia, or the contributor who added the copyrighted code to Servo? Now, if you're a paying customer of Copilot, Microsoft at least says they are going to cover the court fees. Will they do that? I don't know. They at least claim they're going to do so. But this is more for these, like, corporate customers. Servo itself, the project, is not a Copilot customer. It would be the individual developer, and would they care about some individual developer? On the topic of copyright and ownership, the Servo contribution policy currently requires the commit author to sign off commits with the developer certificate of origin, which includes the contribution is based upon previous work that, to the best of my knowledge, is covered under an appropriate open source license, and I have the right under that license to submit that work with modifications, whether created in whole or in part by me, under the same open source license, unless I'm permitted to submit under a different license, as indicated in that file. This is basically you signing off saying, I am allowed to submit the code. If I am not allowed to it, well, all fault falls onto me as the developer, not onto the project. It's basically a very simple legal document. As far as I can tell, there's no way to ensure, there's ways to mitigate, but ensure definitely not. The snippet generated by Copilot was sourced from open source repositories with licenses that are permissive enough to use without a copyright notice. Does the TSC plan to change the policy to remove the DCO sign-off requirement? Also, the contribution was created in whole or in part by me, and I have the right to submit it under the open source license indicated in the file, does not apply here, as most jurisdictions do not consider AI-generated work to be copyrightable by the person who wrote the prompt. I urge you to consider the implications, and there's no escaping it, of this policy update. A good chunk of people, many of which may have considered contributing, and some of which may be active contributors, are going to see this and consider Servo tainted. Merely entertaining AI these days is a statement, and that statement is, we don't care about quality, we care about contributors, all hail the slop machine. Now, putting that part aside, this is very important. Consider Servo tainted. Basically, what's being said here is, if you're accepting AI code, you don't know the license being used from that code, right? You can't say, only use MIT code or only use BSD code. You can write it in the prompt, but you have no guarantee that that is what is going to happen. So, anytime you start accepting these contributions, this is a legal nightmare. And you also have nowhere to guarantee that you're not dealing with leaked code and stolen code, and yes, you don't have a guarantee of that otherwise, but at least in the case of a bad contributor who is stealing proprietary code, that person can be dealt with and you no longer have that problem. In the case of these AI tools, you could have a perfectly well-meaning contributor who is unknowingly giving you code that is going to bring you into a lawsuit. Now, most people here are being fairly negative, but someone wanted to approach this from a different direction. First of all, I appreciate that you decided to have an open and public discussion about this. I hope people's reactions won't make you regret taking that step. Well, they actually had to do it publicly, because either they would say, oh, we had a private discussion and we're making the change, and then everything explodes then, or they have a public discussion and everything explodes then, but at least they haven't implemented the change. I think you should investigate and reflect upon the stark difference in reception to this idea between the TSC members and the respondents in this post. Were TSC members unaware of the arguments being presented here, not convinced of their validity/impact, or did they think that, while valid, they were outweighed by some huge benefits that aren't being discussed here? Another person took issue with the enforcement, so PRs created using Copilot should be tagged accordingly. This is unenforceable, and in the long term will lead to either all PRs getting closer attention when reviewing, or none at all. In one case, this means increased work for maintainers for basically no gain. In other cases, it means potentially buggy, not thought through code getting through the review much more easily. In both cases, the code quality will suffer. Now, this point right here is more about the large-scale tests they want to run. Not that every single commit in the future, if it's AI generated, would need to be tagged as AI generated. It's for the sake of the test, so they can know what is and is not. And only people who were given explicit permission would be allowed to do so in the test. Now, there's a lot being said in this one. I'm not going to read all of it, but I do want to read this one part at the start here. Hi, I like to object against this policy because there's no actual benefit that is mentioned here. Writing code is not the struggle of maintaining an application, and typing documentation is not the struggle of documenting things. For the former, the struggle is actually understanding how to solve a problem and come up with solutions for it, along with fixing subtle errors and logic issues. Writing code is the easiest part. For the latter, accuracy is key, and inaccurate documentation is substantially worse than no documentation. Now, there is one person here that is very important to highlight, a member of the TSC that actually voted in favor of this. Now, this person does not actually make use of AI tools themselves, but they still felt, at least initially, that it would be beneficial to the project. Also, they wrote a blog post on why. Now, with them being in support of the whole AI thing in Servo, you might think this was written using AI tools. As I said, they don't program with AI tools. This was not written with AI tools. They don't use them. Just so we're on the same page here. And they even acknowledge the fact that for a lot of areas, the suggestions are just bad. They're not good. They're not even remotely close to what you would actually want to do. However, I still voted for the change. The closest statement to describe my standpoint is Lady Bird's contributing guide. Over in this is what it says on usage of AI and LLMs. Usage of AI assistants is usually fine, but you are responsible for making sure the quality of the output is up to the standards of the project. Currently, AI-generated output is often too verbose and its quality is subpar compared to what most human contributors produce. Do not use an AI or LLM to generate changes, respond to issues, or interact with PRs without holding the output to the same standards as human written content. Basically, the Ladybird policy is use AI as a tool. Don't become a prompt engineer. I won't allow gibberish if I need to deal with the issue or feature, but if it could help you and you can take the responsibility to meet the standard we set, I'm happy with whatever tools assist you. I think the biggest mistake and lesson we should learn from this is this kind of topic should be open to the public in the first place. We didn't gather the opinion from the community to discuss the solution. I believe some members who vote for the change are also similar to my stance, but the proposal appeals to no one despite its compromise already. Servo is a very unique browser engine shared by the community. It's not dictated by any corporation or BDFL. This is why Servo is the project I wish to push the most and hope it could be the real open source browser that offers freedom. As I was saying earlier, this discussion needed to be happening in public from the start. It shouldn't have been we had a meeting with the TSC and we decided, well, hey, here's the policy we're thinking of doing. What do you think of it? From the very start, they should have been saying, is there any interest in even putting together a policy, putting together an experiment, and then go from there? What worries me the most is the potential of losing major contributors. If you contributed to the Servo before, you should understand how difficult it is to land the features you wish to happen, especially when there are components like script and layout requiring deep know-how to understand how it actually works. There are PRs with lots of comments back and forth that still get stuck for months because no one's entirely sure how certain types work. This is why I voted for the policy change, despite the fact that I'm not fond of AI tools either. I do understand that, but if the person writing the code doesn't understand what they're doing, well, you're basically just shifting the burden from the individual contributor to whoever is doing the triaging of the PR. So someone still needs to understand it. And if the commit is bad because they don't necessarily understand how a type works, I don't think the AI tool is going to have a deep understanding of it either. From all of this, one really good change was suggested, which for some reason, people thumbs down. I don't know if they can't read, or they think what the person is saying is actually bad. I don't know. By the way, the current formulation of the policy excludes anyone who relies on voice coding. Contributions must not include content generated by a large language model or other probabilistic tools. Voice coders, even those who are not using LLMs, are using speech recognition engines that are, of course, probabilistic tools. This is obviously not the intention of their current AI policy, right? The current AI policy isn't to stop people who program by talking. I don't do it myself. I know some people like this, though. This is something that probably should be amended and should be added into their policy. So after all of this discussion, here is where we wound up. Thanks everyone for your feedback here and in other places. Servo TSC would like to share that we've decided to not go forward with this proposal and will keep the AI policy as is. In the future, if we want to do any change to the policy, the discussions will happen in public channels to get early feedback about them. Thanks again. Honestly, this is the best possible thing that could happen from this. This is something that I wish more big projects did, rather than being like, oh, we're going to privately discuss things in the foundation. The community doesn't need to know what we're doing. Actually let people know what's going on, let people get involved early, so you know that you're not going down a completely useless route. Now, what is your stance on AI contributions? Do you think they're a good route to go down? Do you think letting it to any extent works? Or do you think the copyright issues are just too great to handle? I would love to know. And if you're in a project that does have policies one way or another, are you happy with the policies in that project? So, if you liked the video, go like the video. If you really like the video and you want to become one of these amazing people over here, check out the Patreon, subscribe, Silly Bearer Pay, linked in the description down below. That's going to be it for me, and A1.
Something like this.